Chapter 16. It took 3 days for Anne's hand to return to normal. Since returning from the cars, she'd worn gloves everywhere to avoid explaining what had happened. She could only hope it wasn't permanent. And, thankfully, over time, the warts fell off and her skin returned to its pink, fleshy color. But the heaviness inside her remained. In the time it took to recover, Anne realized she'd made a mistake. The cars had ceased to have power over her once she shared her misery, but in doing so, she allowed the cars inside her, and it showed no signs of leaving. When several days passed and she hadn't heard back from the princess, Anne started writing another letter. She planned to explain to Janiah that she was very sorry, but she couldn't continue searching the cars. She had no idea how long she could stay inside the cars before she was fully an imp. 5 hours? 4? Less? She couldn't take the chance. And now that Anne knew the princess didn't know where her father was, her time would be better spent searching for him herself. Then Janiah finally replied, "I could destroy the monarchy without ever setting foot into that wretched curse." And with that, Anne remembered what was at stake, the entire monarchy. As worried as she was about her father's fate, he was one man compared to every living soul under the monarch's care. If Janiah did something to shatter the peace and prosperity of the monarchy, Anne would share the blame. She was in a position to help the princess and prevent catastrophe. Finding her father had to wait. She had to return to the bog. If she didn't, she was doing exactly what the Carse wanted. As everyone in Emberfell slept, Anne packed a small hourglass to take with her into the Carse. Then she and Laius slipped away as they had before. 3 turns tonight, Laius, she instructed once they'd reached the entrance of the Carse. The boy nodded dutifully. 3. More than ever, Anne wished Laius could feel something other than happy. She wanted to know that someone wasn't afraid for her as she was for herself. "I'll stay as long as I can," Anne told herself. "I'll watch for signs. If I start to change, I'll get out at once." At least, that was the plan. She nodded to Laius. Anne took her own hourglass, and together she and Laius turned them upside down. Anne prayed softly that this would be the last time they ever needed to do this. The imps were waiting for Anne at the hook-shaped rock. As always, they bowed low before leading Anne onward. Anne found herself coaxing them along, wanting to get farther in tonight than she'd ever taken her before. But the creature's small legs could only go so fast. They traveled past the castle ruins, trudged through the stream of ankle-deep silt, and scaled a small crag of slick stones. All the while, Anne kept an eye on the small hourglass that hung from a chain on her waist. When the sands ran out, she gave it a turn. 1 hour. The imps began leapfrogging over each other, leading Anne on until they reached a mist-filled oasis. Before them, a still pond, shaped like an eye, interrupted the path. "Welcome," Pearp said before diving into the pool of muck and wallowing about. "Welcome to the garden." The Carse seemed like an odd place for a garden, but then the garden itself was odd. Topiaries, twisting and bent, rose up out of the mere on either side of the path. The low-hanging branches of the Dreadwillow trees were covered with newly bloomed flowers. When Anne leaned over to smell the blossoms, their transparent petals shrunk away and curled up until the flowers looked like claws. The imps draped sinewy weeds around their heads like regal laurels and escorted Anne further. Anne reached out and brushed her fingers against the nearest topiary. A slimy patina of moss and algae fell away, revealing a gnarled, gray-white branch. When Anne inspected it more closely, her mouth went dry. The topiaries were made from bones. Hundreds and hundreds of bones had been piled up and fused together into macabre sculptures. "What is this place?" Anne whispered. Tally nestled up to a topiary, her short arms reaching out as if to embrace it. "Told you. A garden." Anne shook her head. "But it must be more than that." "Now a garden," Pearp said, gesturing ahead. "Then a battlefield." Anne moved to where the imp was pointing and spotted a small island in the middle of a pool of muck. In the center of the island stood a tall stone obelisk. She waited through the mirror until she was close enough to see hundreds, no, thousands of names etched up and down the side. "It's a war memorial," she said in disbelief. The idea seemed absurd to Anne, No one alive in the monarchy had ever known war. War was a myth about faraway lands told so everyone would be better appreciate the peace of the monarchy. But then, Anne was discovering the truth, and fiction had more in common for her lately. She gazed at the monuments of bones all around. Was this what the princess wasn't meant to know? Climbing up, Anne moved onto the small island. Fog rolled in from the densest part of the forest and twinkled with pale gray light. At the base of the cenotaph, the ghostly outlines of two shapes, deep in a silent conversation, took shape. The first shade Anne recognized immediately. It was a young King Izar, robust and healthy, nothing like the shade of the mad king under siege at the castle ruins. Izar spoke to a second man wearing fine clothes and a neatly trimmed beard. Severely angled eyebrows gave his eyes a shifty look. The stranger listened carefully as Izar spoke and nodded occasionally. Izar held out his hand. The stranger paused, looking suddenly unsure. Then, shoulders slumped, the stranger reached out and shook the king's hand. The shades flickered away, only to reform a moment later and repeat the conversation. "Who is the man with King Izar?" Anne called over her shoulder to the imps, who were now pelting each other with patties of mud and grass. "He has many names," Telly called back, gargling on swamp water. "Many, many names." "Many names throughout a life," Pirip added. Anne frowned. "Why are they shaking hands?" "Why does anyone shake hands?" Pirip giggled. "Because they've just met," Anne thought. "Or they're friends. Or—" She moved around the memorial to where the mist danced about, creating a new scene. This time she saw King Izar flanked by two soldiers whose army bore the royal crest. The stranger stood across from the king, his fine clothes replaced with a stiff black robe. At a wave from Izar, the two soldiers stepped forward. The stranger presented each soldier with a long, flowing robe, which each immediately donned. Izar watched as the soldiers pulled large hoods over their heads. Crimson hoods. "Pirip, what am I watching? Is this the creation of the Crimson Hoods?" The imp swam around near Anne and gaped at the shades. "Don't know Crimson Hoods. Only the architect and his keepers." "The architect? Is that the man's name?" Tally scuttled up onto the island, sat on Anne's feet. "Here, as you see him, he is the architect. But not for long. Not for long, not for long, not for long." "Well, why? What changes then?" "The curse, of course. The curse changes everything." Anne understood. This wasn't just the creation of the Crimson Hoods. She was witnessing the creation of the curse itself. It was created by the architect. The shades vanished and then reappeared. The architect presented the hooded robes to Izar's soldiers again. The Crimson Hoods worked for the architect, who worked for King Izar. That's why they shook hands, she realized. They were making a deal, and turning two royal soldiers into Crimson Hoods was part of that deal. More than ever before, Anne felt she was genuinely close to some answers. Before she could interrogate Pirip and Tally further, a rush of wind washed over the island, carrying a distant tune. The song. It was back. The imps swayed to the music, mesmerized by its eerie melody. Anne hadn't heard it on her last two visits to the Carse. She'd all but forgotten about it. But hearing it again reminded her that someone lived here, and if she wanted real answers, not the riddles of Pirip and Tally, Anne had to find its singer. Anne waded away from the island, back to the path they'd been following. She raced down the muddy lane until it split into a fork. Her head spun around, trying to pinpoint the singing, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "Wait, the Highness!" Pirip called as she and Tally scurried to catch up with Anne. "Wait!" Anne was about to choose the path to the right when a flash of color down the left path caught her eye. The color stood out in this place that seemed to forbid hue and radiance. She went to the left, squinting into the fog. And then she saw it, leaned up against a dreadwillow, a crutch with a wide purple ribbon tied around it. That is the end of chapter 16.